Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is CityTalk. R.I.P. Big Labor editorialized the Post, while the Times reported at Labor Group a sense of a broader movement. Funeral or fresh start? Here to talk about the life, death, or renaissance of the labor movement is Joshua Freeman. Joshua is professor of history at Queens College and the Graduate Center. He is the author most recently of American Empire, The Rise of a Global Power, The Democratic Revolution at Home, 1945 to 2000, as well as In Transit, the Transport Workers Union in New York City, 1933 to 1966. Joshua is the Dean of New York Labor Historians and 13 years ago published the award-winning social and labor history, Working Class New York, Life and Labor Since World War II. Professor Freeman is a frequent commentator on organized labor and union politics. Welcome. Hector Figueroa is the president of Local 32BJ of the Service Employees International Union, the largest property services union in the country, representing now nearly 150,000 workers in New York State and 8 other states and Washington, D.C. Hector was elected president of 32BJ in 2012 and as a member of SEIU's executive board that same year. Welcome, Hector. Welcome, Joshua. Okay. Bottom line, where are we going with labor? Let's start with the AFL-CIO Convention that occurred a couple of days before the New York primary. There's a lot of excitement coming out of it, but a lot of skepticism too. Joshua, your reactions?
Well, I think this was a recognition that labor is in such an existential crisis that they have to try to do different things. And in that sense, it was a very outwardly looking, optimistic conference, because they did all kinds of things, moving towards alliances with non-labor groups, opening up the AFL-CIO to people who don't work places where there are collective bargaining agreements, many things like that, which I think are positive and interesting steps. On the other hand, the reality is they're doing it because they're in a very bad shape. Yeah,
can they convert that real energy and excitement, which friends of mine and associates is palpable, can they convert that energy into effective action? That's the question.
Well, that remains to be seen, and it also remains to be seen what we mean by effective action. A lot of these things are looking more to the political realm or passing laws that create labor standards rather than a strictly collective bargaining approach.
Sure.
And I think that's a recognition of how tiny the labor movement is in the private sector. Now New York's a bit of an exception there, but so I think it's important looking for other ways of speaking for and helping working people besides the contract.
Okay. Hector, SEIU, you weren't there, the union's not there, hasn't been part of the AFL-CIO since 2005. Explain why and your reaction to the convention.
Sure. SEIU left the AFL-CIO to focus on organizing and to try to develop a program that could include strategic partnerships and include organizing beyond our core industries. And we continue to execute along that plan.
So you were ahead of the curve, if you will.
In some ways, but also we respect and we work greatly with the AFL-CIO unions. Both in the local CLC and state councils were members of those. SEIU didn't indicate to all the unions to withdraw from those councils. So we think that the convention the AFL had was a good convention. We had our own convention in 2012, very similar in terms of the themes. We invited groups from the community, different worker organizations. So there is a like-mindedness about the recognition of the problem and the need to restrain labor. There is a difference, though, in which we're still trying to figure out how organizing non-union workers from fast food to home care to security to airports is still a core part of the program. We have not given up on the idea yet that people can fight to form a union, but we realize that that fight cannot be just a fight about a localized occupational or industrial group. It has to embrace the fight of the 99%. It has to embrace the themes of addressing income inequality in addition to restoring labor power.
Also, it seems coming out of the convention, particularly their resolution number 5, a broad, inclusive, and effective labor movement, that this goes beyond workers and it includes students. And in a sense, it seems as if they're trying to construct a large social movement more than a labor movement or a worker movement.
Yeah, well, I think that's true, and they're very explicit about it. They want to have alliances with NOW, with Sierra Club. They just signed a formal alliance the other day with United Students Against Sweatshops. This is not totally new. If you look at the CIO in the late 30s, they had close working relationships with the NAACP, with progressive farmer groups. They conceived themselves as part of a political bloc. In that case, very much allied with Roosevelt and the New Deal. And in that sense, I think we're seeing a return to this more capacious notion of what labor should be doing and its place. And I think it's a healthy change from, well, it's a long time ago, but the George Meany years where everyone who looked a little bit different wasn't, totally part of it, was treated with contempt and pushed away.
And with this convention, it seemed as if this pall of depression that has surrounded the national unions, certainly not a lot of the local unions, and certainly not 32BJ, seemed to have dissipated, at least for the moment. It was sort of, a cheering from the sideline and from the stands about what was going on. Let's go to 32BJ. You folks have expanded rather dramatically over the last couple of months, adding another 25,000 workers, another 3 states. Talk about 32BJ, SEIU, and sort of your agenda locally as well as nationally.
Sure. Our agenda is very simply that we want good jobs and have strong communities. And we look at those 2 pillars of our campaign, which, by the way, were the theme under which our members participated in the recent Boston primary, and in New York, and in Florida, and in New Jersey, because we believe that we need to have a union that fights for its members, that represents all the workers in our industry that do the same work. But we also realize that that's not enough. So we embrace the themes out of the AFL, out of the SEIU Convention, of building a broader movement. And in our agenda, we want to fight for affordable housing, for benefits that do not necessarily have to come through collective bargaining, like paid sick days, increases in the minimum wage.
Legislative.
Legislative, exactly. So what we envision is building a union of property service workers that unites and elevates standards of the people who work in our sector, but at the same time joins others in the fight for the general interest of working people.
Okay, talk about what successes has SEIU 32BJ in the electoral arena, whether in New York or elsewhere.
Well, in the electoral arena, we have elected many people into Congress, and we supported the re-election of the president, while at the same time staying on course on fighting for immigration reform, fighting against the debt ceiling, debate this week. And also in New York, we have been contributing importantly, I think, to the election of a progressive city council in the past elections and on this one. And currently, we are committed to elect public advocate Bill de Blasio to become the next mayor of New York. We help in the election of Scott Stringer. What we're trying to do with our members is giving them an opportunity to get involved in elections, to register members in our neighborhoods. Our union is largely people of color, large number of Latino immigrants. If we can expand the electorate and the civic participation of those workers and their neighbors and their families, we think we can contribute to the movement.
One of the primary components of the commentary around the primary election is that labor was divided, that the major unions, including SEIU, split all over the place in terms of the chief Democratic candidates, 4 of them. But you have a different sense of that. Talk about how you view what occurred.
Yeah, my sense is that everyone who entered the Democratic primary, maybe with one exception or 2, but I actually think most of them, were committed to a progressive agenda with different colors, different gradations on the importance of some issues. Some folks were running a general election, trying to appeal to the general electorate, and others were running to win the primary. And we believe that all the unions play an important role in getting Bill Thompson, John Liu, Bill de Blasio, Chris Quinn, who got most of the union endorsement to embrace an agenda of working families, to speak about stop and freeze, and to speak about the issues that working people care. Naturally, the one who was most consistent and captured the imagination and the hearts of primary voters was Bill de Blasio, and we have to concede that. He ran a very good campaign. He was consistent on those themes. But all candidates were able to have a DNA of labor issues because they got labor backing. And I believe that made it easier for everyone really to quickly, relatively speaking, come around Bill de Blasio after primary day.
Okay, Josh, talk about it. I mean, given your background as a labor historian, particularly a New York City labor historian, what is the status of unions politically in New York City at the moment, right now, beginning of October of 2013?
Well, I think they're very powerful. They still have huge capacity in the political arena. They can have field operations. They can mobilize their own members. They can work to the neighborhoods. So I think they're very prized as partisan activists, and I think that they can, as Hector said, help shape the whole tenor of an election. How this necessarily converts in governance, remains to be seen. I mean, on a national level, labor does a terrific job, and yet it very rarely gets its own highest priorities. Look at President Obama. Labor law reform didn't get it. Healthcare Act, who hurts the most? Well, some of the union-sponsored healthcare plans. So I think in the political realm, labor is still very strong in New York. But let's see what happens, going forward.
Okay, let's talk about organizing. Let's jump around a little bit. Where are the chief opportunities to organize workers as workers? Going more strictly in terms of when we think of labor unions. Where's the opportunity? Where's the potential for growth? Go ahead.
Well, I think it's in the private sector. I think especially in New York, but also nationally, that's where the attention has to be.
And that's where the declines have been the most dramatic.
Yeah, we're down to 14% in New York City. Nationally, we're below 7%.
Right, like 6.6.
Yeah, exactly.
Whoa.
And what's really striking is industries like communications and hotel, or in construction, which once were hugely unionized, now have very big non-union niches. They're bigger. I wouldn't even call them niches anymore. Sectors within this. And then, of course, there's the vast expanse of jobs that never were unionized. Many of these low-wage workers. So I think it's in the private sector. A lot of the low-wage workforce is immigrants, so it's among immigrant workers. But also white-collar workers. We live in the financial capital of the United States, and those tellers and those clerical workers at the banks don't have great jobs. They're not in unions. I think that's a tremendous potential area for growth. So I think almost any place you stand on a street corner and look around, there are going to be private sector workers who need a union.
So again, Hector, where is the opportunity? Low wage, minority, Black and Hispanic?
I think the opportunities are as wide as they have been.
Go ahead.
Over the last 2 decades or 3, we have seen how the middle income of Americans have lost a significant amount of real earnings. The top 1% has been getting the bulk of the national income, while the middle class has been stagnant. Productivity has increased by 70% in the last 30 years, and wages for the middle income groups have increased less than 7%. Imagine yourself in 1979 as a worker being promised a 4%, 5% wage increase, but only by the time that you were in 2013. You will throw that contract out of the table. That's what we have done, both as a movement and as a country. So what labor needs to do now is really to reimagine itself. So urban, service worker, blue collar, white collar, multiracial, workers can see in the labor movement a vehicle to improve their lives. And people are responding to that message. You have the Tea Party, you have Occupy, and you have a new effort to organize in the labor movement, from fast food to home care to security. Those are the occupations that we have really to go after, banks, service sector in general. So the big question to me is, will we transform internally in our organization sufficiently fast, A, to get a mandate from our members to invest resources in organizing outside of our industries and occupations, and B, to use our political capital at the service of winning for those workers. And that is a change that time will tell whether we were able to adapt quick enough to go in that direction, or if we continue to sort of look at that goal in the distance but not willing to take the risks that are necessary.
Okay, let's look at a future Mayor de Blasio. What might your advice be, Josh, given your long historical perspective? What pieces of advice might you give Mayor-elect on, what is it, November 6th, if the Board of Elections counted the ballots yet? What advice might you give?
Well, you know, he's got a lot of things that confront him. I'd give him some advice that he'd jump to, you know, fire Ray Kelly and a few other things like that, you know, and deal with education. But on the labor front, you know, it was very interesting. In the primary contest, he made a statement which didn't get a lot of coverage, where he said that as mayor, he would promote private sector unionization. And I would say, think long and hard about what that actually means and what the city can do to facilitate a fair, you know, playing field for those kinds of decisions, you know, and to promote, you know, what used to be called high road type of jobs, jobs that will provide decent living. And, you know, obviously a lot of this depends on the national and international economy, national policy, but there are some tools the mayor has, you know, from the bully pulpit to zoning to local legislation that can be brought to bear. So, you know, if he's serious about income inequality as a central dimension of what he wants to do as mayor, then helping workers help themselves, you know, seems to me to be one component of that. That's what the federal government did in the 1930s. That was the whole logic of the Wagner Act, which was to give the tools for workers to help themselves. Let's see the mayor try to do that.
Okay, isn't there, though, sort of an inherent conflict between that goal and the mundane goals of balancing budgets, particularly in light of pensions, health care, for retirees? Is there this conflict?
I mean, the mayor is management in the sense that the city employs a huge part of our workforce.
Sure.
But the mayor of New York is one of those jobs that actually can project onto the nation and internationally what you know, future generations need to be concerned about, from climate change to immigration to issues that the current mayor has addressed. But we need to add also income inequality, democracy, and opportunities for our children. And I think the mayor can set the tone under which workers can be more courageous about organizing and unions more confident about winning, in which immigrant workers can feel welcome, and in which we develop a city that looks at the current economy that we have of a service financial center, but tries to trickle down really the gains for workers by increasing their bargaining power, and then anticipate tourism, green jobs, you know, and other initiatives where as those jobs develop, there is a commitment from City Hall that they need to be good paying jobs in which you can raise a family. I think that by itself will help contribute to the national narrative, not just the city.
Okay. Is there a New York City labor agenda, recognizing that labor is not monolithic and there are often divisions within labor? But is there a general agenda, what specific policies or programs or legislation might labor push for in a de Blasio administration? Either one.
Well, I got to say, and Hector may disagree with me, I think the answer to that is no. I don't think there is. I mean, I think we have a few very large unions, including Hectors, that have the capacity of national unions, you know, really. And they're pretty self-sufficient in a lot of ways. And of course, a huge percentage of our workers are in the public sector.
Right.
Now, there's a public sector agenda about getting contracts and keeping affordable health care and so forth. But I don't see a labor agenda. And particularly, I don't see the public sector committing themselves to the organization of private sector workers. I mean, I think one key to the success of SEIU and the Teamsters is that they can subsidize internally.
Right.
They have public sector, you know, members, and they could use that to help organize private sectors. But, you know, I think we have to get across union boundaries. So I think there really isn't a commitment to organizing in the New York City labor movement as a whole. I mean, there's a verbal commitment, but we don't see the resources really being put into that. We don't see the kind of cross-union innovative programs, you know. I think people are so focused on the immediate needs of their own particular groups of members that they haven't stepped back. And I totally understand why people do that. But I think in the long run, we're in trouble. With 14% of our workforce in the private sector unionized, we are actually a very vulnerable labor movement.
Hector, respond to his response.
Well, I think Professor Freeman is right in the sense that that central common agenda has not been articulated or manifested itself publicly. However, there are pockets that are incredibly encouraging. On the one hand, we have begun to work more and more with the hotel trades and the building trades in something we call Build Up New York to collaborate and figure out how we organize the non-union construction sector. Because we know, our members know, Peter Ward's members in the hotel trades know, that if hotels and housing are built non-union, eventually the rest of the buildings will be non-union. Second, Vinny Alvarez is playing an incredibly positive role. It's been a long time due, but we have now a central labor head whose main job is really to get people at the table and figure out how to help each other.
Okay, just stop for a second.
Yeah.
This Central Labor Council mess that's been going on for a while, is there really stable leadership and forward-looking leadership? Because it's really been afloat for a while.
There really is, and one example is how we work on the city council election.
Talk about that.
Labor cooperated incredibly in the screening process. We joined forces with organizations like the Working Families Party, Made the Road New York, NYCC, and others. And of the list of candidates that were endorsed, the vast majority of them won. And we were knocking at doors side by side with public sector workers, building trades, and other unionized workers. So Vinny has that vision. The question will be, I think, at the end of the day, about organizing and whether we can get to that point in which teachers, District 37, other unions, building trades, 32BJ, 1199, could envision a city hall that promotes the organizing of private sectors in the way that de Blasio is talking about. Not just really winning our back pay and winning our contracts, but realizing that major restructuring will be necessary from the point of view of how the city functions, but a major refocus of us fighting not just for our members, but fighting for the neighborhoods and the communities where they are. I think that can happen, and that people would like to get there, and I'm hoping that by having our organizers, political directors work together through the CLC and in other venues, working with taxi workers, with domestic workers, and other movements, we're going to find the answer. But it's going to take some time.
Okay, now one of the things that, go ahead,
I was just going
Josh.
to add, I think one of the things that we should not fly over is that the Central Labor Council in New York was a pioneer in bringing into itself groups like Taxi Workers Alliance and Domestic Workers Union, which are not traditional labor groups. And that's exactly what the National AFL-CIO did. So in a sense, the New York model got adopted as the national
being
model.
nationalized.
Exactly. But, I think it's still, in terms of how many workers have seen their day-to-day lives transformed by this, still in the beginning stage.
Sure.
Exactly.
So the question is, can you scale that up? And I give credit to the Central Labor Council because I think they really have been open to trying new things. And I would love to see more investment in those kinds of things and see how they do. It may work, it may not, but let's give it a shot.
And in your previous remarks, Hector, you mentioned back pay. Is that a sine qua non of the labor movement, that, if we can talk about a labor movement, that all of the municipal labor contracts, which Mayor Bloomberg, as Greg David said, kicked the can down the road? The estimates are $7 billion. I mean, is that possible?
I mean, it's really hard to tell until de Blasio gets into City Hall and looks at the finances and the new City Council can redirect priorities. I'm sure it's going to be incredibly challenging. But what I would like to extend as a message, and this is what we've been saying to our school members, who, by the way, are 5,000 workers pending on this. They're privately contracted, but they are part of this group, is that we need to rethink how we provide for health care. We need to rethink how we protect our pensions, not in terms of concessions, but in terms of looking at ways for us to, from the top down, reorganize city employment and services better. A lot of money goes into management in City Hall. Tremendous amount of dollars into really unnecessary contracting, where contracted workers that provide services were ignored or left behind. So there is a lot of potential. Could it get to $7 billion without raising taxes? Probably not.
Or service cuts in another
or service cuts in another arena, but we need to rethink this. And then the relationship of New York and Albany needs to be such that we need to build a progressive agenda for 2014 as there are elections at the state level out of what we're doing in City Hall.
Too bad we're running out of time. I'm getting really excited here. Isn't there almost an inherent conflict between the city and the state and the political calculations of its chief executives? One would think that state government, including the governor, would love to cut taxes. How does Bill de Blasio get a tax on folks making more than $500,000 a year? How does he get permission to do that from Albany?
Well, I'm not an expert on Albany, but I think you have to build a coalition that goes beyond the New York City boundaries, obviously. So you have to build some sort of statewide, not just city-based, vision of confronting the problem of unemployment, which is huge upstate. They're in worse shape than we are. Income inequality, upstate as well as downstate.
Yep.
And I think there are a lot of pieces there to do that. It's going to be tough. Cuomo is, Cuomo did some terrible things for labor. In fact, he set a lot of the precedents, which are hurting now labor in New York City with this terrible contracts for state labor. So, within the Democratic Party, there's a very complicated politics.
Huge.
And, on the other hand, he's very powerful. A lot of people like him for other things he did. So I think it's going to take a very skillful effort by the mayor and his allies if they're going to get that change. On the other hand, it's a change that really hurts so few people. It doesn't hurt anybody. The people it's going to affect are so few and so rich that the idea that there's even a debate about this is really a sad commentary. These people are so well off that if we're asking a tiny little bit more, it seems to me on a moral level, it's not a tough case to make.
What about on a fiscal level?
Well, it's only going to help the city. It's not going to hurt the state, and it's not going to hurt these folks. And they're not moving to Florida, believe me. Estonia, they're not.
No, right.
Yeah.
Okay. One last question, which you both can't answer. You talked about the city council elections and the possible election of a progressive, both as speaker and a large number of quote unquote progressives in a caucus. What do you see on January 1st, 2014, assuming again that de Blasio wins? Because if Lota wins, you've got a totally different game.
I see an unprecedented effort to really try to have a majority in the city council who's going to put working families first, is going to look at the issues that the electorate, gave us a mandate in this election: income inequality, opportunity for our children before they enter school, and security in the streets without compromise of our civil rights. And we're going to see, a council that is going to be the kind of wind that can move, de Blasio in the direction that needs to happen. This is still a very challenged city, but we need to create a movement through the council, into our neighborhoods, through civil society that continues to push in a progressive direction.
What do you say?
Well, I agree. I think it's going to be especially effective if there's also social mobilization. If we learn anything about Occupy, you could see how even a movement that on its own terms doesn't exactly succeed sets the agenda. And I think we're going to need to see neighborhoods, we're going to have to see social movements of all kinds saying, okay, now make good on that.
Thank you. Thanks to my guests, Hector Figueroa and Joshua Freeman. See you here next week on CUNY TV. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.